In the early years of the 20th century, Canada stood as a dominion of the British Empire, a self-governing colony that had earned increasing independence since Confederation in 1867, but had not yet achieved full legislative autonomy. Canadians were proud of their nation-building spirit, their expanding economy, and their growing sense of identity. Yet they were still bound by legal and political ties to Britain, particularly in matters of foreign policy and constitutional law. The British Parliament retained the authority to legislate for Canada, and the British Crown remained the ultimate source of legal power. While Canada operated with its own Parliament, Prime Minister, and regional governments, it had not yet stepped completely out of the imperial shadow. The experience of World War I began to shift that dynamic forever, as Canadian soldiers fought and died in battles like Vimy Ridge and Passchendaele. A new sense of national pride emerged. Canadians no longer saw themselves merely as subjects of the empire, but as citizens of a country that had proven itself on the global stage. When the war ended and Canada signed the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 as a separate signatory, it marked a turning point in Canada's diplomatic standing. This act was further solidified when Canada joined the League of Nations independently, a move that symbolized growing international recognition of its sovereignty at home. The desire for autonomy grew stronger as Canadians questioned why foreign affairs and constitutional amendments still required British oversight and approval. Political leaders like Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King believed that Canada had matured beyond colonial status and deserved the full powers of a sovereign nation. The tension between tradition and transformation came to a head in the 1920s as the issue of imperial authority clashed with the realities of self-government. One of the key moments in this journey was the King-Byng Affair of 1926, when Governor-General Lord Byng refused a request by Mackenzie King to dissolve Parliament and call new elections. This sparked a constitutional crisis and led to a heated public debate about the role of the Governor-General and the limits of British interference in Canadian political life. Mackenzie King used the incident to rally public support for greater autonomy, insisting that no representative of the Crown should override the will of the elected government. It was a bold declaration, and one that would echo through history soon after. At the 1926 Imperial Conference, Canada joined with other dominions like Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and the Irish Free State to assert the principle that each dominion was equal in status to Britain and not subordinate in domestic or external affairs. This agreement, known as the Balfour Declaration, laid the philosophical groundwork for a legal transformation that would come a few years later. It stated clearly that the dominions were autonomous communities within the British Empire, equal in status and freely associated under the Crown. The challenge now was to turn that statement of principle into law and thereby formalize the new relationship between Britain and its dominions, a relationship that would soon be crystallized in the Statute of Westminster. Following the Imperial Conference of 1926, the Balfour Declaration had established the philosophical foundation for the redefinition of Canada's status within the British Empire. But philosophy alone was not enough to dismantle the legal framework that still bound the dominions to the British Parliament. Canadian leaders understood that true sovereignty required more than words. It required legal recognition. In British law itself, throughout the late 1920s and into the early 1930s, Canadian political voices pushed for legislation that would turn the principles of the Balfour Declaration into enforceable law. Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King, now at the height of his political power, sought to codify Canada's autonomy without undermining the symbolic unity of the British Commonwealth. He believed that Canada could maintain its allegiance to the Crown while also exercising complete legislative independence. This delicate balance required careful negotiation and cooperation among the dominions and Britain. In 1930, another imperial conference convened, and this time the dominions were determined to transform their equal status into legal fact. The discussions were complex and filled with constitutional nuance, but they culminated in a consensus that would change the course of Canadian history. On December 11, 1931, the British Parliament passed the Statute of Westminster, a landmark law that granted full legislative equality to the dominions including Canada. It was a turning point in the legal relationship between Canada and Britain. For the first time, Canadian laws could not be overridden by British statutes unless Canada explicitly requested it. The British Parliament could no longer legislate for Canada, and Canadian law no longer required approval or review by British authorities. The statute also recognized that the Crown was not a single unified institution, but rather one that acted separately within each dominion. This meant that the King of Canada, though the same person as the King of Britain, would act only on the advice of Canadian ministers within Canada. The passage of the Statute of Westminster was met with mixed reactions among political leaders. It was hailed as a moment of national maturity, a recognition that Canada had grown into a sovereign state in its own right. Historians, journalists, and scholars called it the most significant constitutional development since Confederation, and it was celebrated in legal circles as a triumph of peaceful constitutional evolution rather than violent revolution, yet the statute did not change everything overnight. Certain areas of constitutional authority, particularly the amending of the British North America Act, remained with the British Parliament, since Canada had not yet developed its own mechanism for constitutional amendment. This limitation reflected the complexity of federalism. In Canada, where provincial and federal powers were tightly interwoven, and the provinces themselves had not reached agreement on how constitutional amendments should be handled. Even so, the Statute of Westminster marked a decisive break from colonial dependency. It gave Canada the authority to make its own foreign policy decisions without seeking permission from London. It allowed Canada to negotiate treaties, sign international agreements, and appoint ambassadors as a fully sovereign nation. Canadian diplomats began to assert their country's interests on the world stage, and Canadian foreign policy began to diverge from British policy in subtle but significant ways. For example, during the lead-up to World War II, Canada independently debated its entry into the conflict, and after the German invasion of Poland in 1939, Parliament held its own vote before declaring war on Germany 1 week after Britain did. This symbolic act demonstrated that Canada was no longer an appendage of the British Empire, but a nation capable of making its own decisions, even in matters of war and peace. Domestically, the statute reinforced Canadian control over internal affairs and validated the decisions of Canadian courts, legislatures, and political institutions. It also had profound implications for the development of Canadian nationalism, and identity Canadians began to see themselves less as British subjects and more as citizens of a distinct country, one that had earned its place. Among the sovereign nations of the world, the Statute of Westminster became a foundational text in Canada's constitutional journey, a moment when Canada formally stepped into the circle of independent states while maintaining its place within. The Commonwealth of Nations, the British Empire itself, began to evolve from a centralized imperial structure into a loose association of equal and sovereign countries, tied together by shared history, language, and institutions in this new model. Canada played a leading role advocating for cooperation, mutual respect, and the peaceful evolution of colonial relationships. As decades passed and other former colonies sought independence, many looked to Canada's example of negotiated constitutional transformation as a path forward. The statute also paved the way for further milestones in Canadian sovereignty, including the creation of Canadian citizenship in 1947, the replacement of the British Judicial Committee of the Privy Council with the Supreme Court of Canada as the final court of appeal, and ultimately the patriation of the Constitution. In 1982, the Statute of Westminster was not the end of Canada's constitutional journey, but it was a major turning point, one that affirmed Canada's status as a self-governing democratic and sovereign state within an evolving international order. In the aftermath of the Statute of Westminster, Canada began to assert itself not only as a sovereign country in legal terms, but also as a responsible actor on the world stage. The 1930s brought with them immense global instability, and as fascism rose in Europe and militarism spread in Asia, the world edged closer to another catastrophic conflict. Canada now had the power to choose its own path in global affairs, and when World War II erupted in 1939, it faced a defining test of its newfound sovereignty. Unlike in 1914, when Canada had automatically entered World War I as part of the British Empire. In 1939, Canada made the decision. Independently, Prime Minister Mackenzie King presented the matter to Parliament, and on September 10, 1939, after full debate, Canada declared war on Germany exactly 1 week after Britain had done so. It was a carefully staged moment meant to demonstrate to the world and to Canadians that the nation was no longer bound by the decisions of another country, even though the choice ultimately aligned with Britain's. It was made on Canada's own terms. During the war, Canada emerged as a vital contributor to the Allied cause, providing troops training facilities, resources, and political leadership. The war accelerated Canada's transformation into a fully functioning sovereign nation as it expanded its international relationships, hosted wartime summits, and forged bilateral ties with other countries, particularly the United States. The experience deepened Canada's sense of national identity and solidified public support for a more independent foreign policy. After the war, Canada joined the newly formed United Nations as a founding member and played a key role in the development of its peacekeeping principles. It also became an active member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and participated in major global conferences that shaped the post-war order. These were not the actions of a colony. They were the actions of a mature nation operating on its own authority. Meanwhile, at home, the Canadian government continued the process of legal and institutional separation from Britain. Even though the Statute of Westminster had granted legislative independence, it had not yet resolved the issue of constitutional amendments since the British North America Act of 1867 remained a British statute. Any changes to the Canadian Constitution still had to go through the British Parliament. This peculiar situation created an incomplete sovereignty, a nation that was legally independent but not yet master of its own constitutional future. Various attempts were made over the following decades to develop a domestic amending formula that could be accepted by both the federal government and the provinces, but the issue proved deeply divisive. The diversity of Canada's regions and the unique status of Quebec complicated the search for consensus. In the meantime, other important steps were taken. The establishment of the Canadian Citizenship Act in 1947 formally created a separate Canadian identity distinct from British subject status. Canadians now carried Canadian passports and swore allegiance to Canada rather than to Britain. In 1949, the Supreme Court of Canada replaced the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council in London as the highest court of appeal, giving Canada full judicial independence and ending the final vestige of British legal oversight. Even symbols began to change, with growing calls for a Canadian flag that represented the country's unique identity, culminating in the adoption of the red and white maple leaf flag in 1965, which replaced the old red ensign that carried the Union Jack. Throughout these changes, the Statute of Westminster remained a foundational legal pillar, a quiet but powerful reminder that Canada's path to independence had been gradual, peaceful, and built on negotiation rather than revolution. Unlike many countries whose independence came through bloodshed and rebellion, Canada had negotiated its sovereignty step by step, and the Statute of Westminster was the moment that gave it the authority to complete that process in its own time and on its own terms. It was also a model for other countries within the Commonwealth, many of whom followed Canada's example as they transitioned from colonies to dominions to fully independent states by the 1960s and 1970s. The British Empire had largely transformed into the modern Commonwealth of Nations, a voluntary association of sovereign countries connected by shared values and historical ties. Canada remained an influential member, advocating for human rights, democracy, development, and international cooperation in this evolving international landscape. The spirit of the Statute of Westminster lived on as a cornerstone of Canadian constitutional history. It had not resolved every issue, nor had it made Canada completely sovereign in an instant, but it had broken the chains of legislative subordination and given Canadians the power and the responsibility to shape their own destiny. It was now up to them to decide how far they would go in completing that journey. As Canada moved into the final decades of the 20th century, the unfinished business left. By the Statute of Westminster became increasingly urgent. The inability to amend its own constitution without British approval remained a glaring anomaly in an otherwise independent nation. This paradox was particularly troublesome for Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who came to power with a bold vision of national unity, civil rights, and full sovereignty. He believed that Canada could not be truly independent until it could control its own constitution and guarantee the rights of its citizens through a codified Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The Statute of Westminster had provided the foundation for legislative equality, but it had left the door open for Britain to remain the legal guardian of the British North America Act. And that door needed to be closed in 1980 after a failed referendum on Quebec sovereignty. Trudeau renewed his focus on patriating the Constitution. His goal was to bring the Constitution home from Britain, establish a domestic amending formula, and enshrine a Charter of Rights that would protect individual freedoms across the country. However, this effort was met with fierce resistance from several provinces who feared that a centralized charter would erode their powers and undermine. The federal balance negotiations between the federal and provincial governments intensified, leading to a historic constitutional conference in 1981, where political leaders debated the future of the country throughout the process. The legacy of the Statute of Westminster hovered over every discussion. It had granted Canada the legal space to negotiate its own future, but it had also revealed the challenges of governing a country as diverse as Canada, where cultural, linguistic, and regional identities were deeply entrenched. After months of tension and last-minute negotiations, a breakthrough came when all provinces except Quebec agreed to a new constitutional package. The Constitution Act of 1982, which included the Canada Act, passed by the British Parliament, and the Constitution Act, passed by Canada, marked the final legal severing of ties between Canada and Britain. It ended the British role in Canadian constitutional amendments and established a Made in Canada Constitution. Complete with an amending formula and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the Act was signed into law by Queen Elizabeth II and Prime Minister Trudeau on Parliament Hill in April 1982, a moment both symbolic and substantive that signaled the full realization of Canadian sovereignty. Although Quebec did not sign the agreement, the Constitution Act of 1982 was a direct continuation of the sovereignty established by the Statute of Westminster. It was the final chapter in a long journey that had begun with the recognition that Canada was no longer a subordinate colony, but a country with the legal and moral authority to govern itself. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms transformed the relationship between the Canadian people and their government. By enshrining fundamental freedoms, legal rights, and equality under the law, it also marked a shift in national identity toward a more inclusive, multicultural, and rights-based society. The Statute of Westminster had made such a transformation legally possible, but it was the political will of Canadian leaders and citizens that brought it into reality in the decades that followed the Constitution Act of 1982. Canada continued to evolve as a global leader in democracy, peacekeeping, and human rights. Its model of peaceful constitutional change became an inspiration to other countries struggling with issues of decolonization, federalism, and national identity. The Statute of Westminster was studied in classrooms, cited in courtrooms, and remembered in ceremonies as the moment when Canada claimed its place among the family of fully sovereign nations. It was a testament to the power of law diplomacy and democratic evolution, and it stood in contrast to the violent struggles that marked the independence of so many other countries at its core. The Statute of Westminster was more than a piece of legislation. It was a declaration that Canadians had earned the right to chart their own course, to shape their own institutions, and to speak in their own voice on the world stage. Its legacy was not only legal, but emotional, cultural, and deeply national. It told the story of a people who, through patience, negotiation, and perseverance, had transformed themselves from colonial subjects into full citizens of a sovereign and self-determined country. In the years that followed the patriation of the Constitution and the formalization of Canadian control over its legal and constitutional future, the legacy of the Statute of Westminster remained deeply embedded in the country's identity. Although the Constitution Act of 1982, with its Charter of Rights and Freedoms, is often seen as the final step in Canada's journey toward full sovereignty, the truth is that none of those later developments would have been possible without the legal and philosophical foundation laid by the Statute of Westminster, passed in 1931. It was this statute that gave Canada and other dominions of the British Empire the authority to make and amend their own laws without interference from the British Parliament. And to determine the scope of their own political development through it, Canada had, for the first time in its history, achieved legislative independence. It could now pass laws without needing Britain's approval, and British laws would no longer apply to Canada, unless Canada specifically requested them. This simple shift represented a radical transformation in the relationship between colony and empire, and even though many Canadians at the time may not have fully grasped its significance, the Statute of Westminster effectively marked the moment when Canada ceased to be a legal dependency and became a fully autonomous country in the eyes of the law. Yet because it did not automatically transfer all remaining powers, such as constitutional amendment or head of state appointments, it existed as part of a broader and longer journey toward full nationhood, a journey that would continue to unfold over the next 50 years. The statute had far-reaching implications not just legally but also symbolically and psychologically for a people who had long seen themselves as subjects of a larger imperial family. Its passing sparked new questions about national identity, culture, language, and political direction if Canada was now sovereign in law. What did that mean for the way Canadians saw themselves and their relationship to Britain? What would happen to the monarchy, to the flag, to the anthem, and to the shared institutions that had bound the country to its colonial past? In the decades that followed the Statute of Westminster, each of these questions was asked and re-asked by politicians, scholars, artists, and ordinary Canadians, and each sparked further conversations and sometimes fierce debates about the nature of Canadian sovereignty as Canada took on a more active role in global affairs, especially during and after World War II. It began to develop a clearer sense of its distinct voice. In the international arena, the war had provided an opportunity to demonstrate leadership, diplomacy, and military capability. Independent of Britain, Canada had entered the war through its own parliamentary vote in 1939 and had contributed significantly on all fronts, from the beaches of Normandy to the skies over Europe, from the industrial might of wartime factories to the humanitarian leadership of post-war relief and reconstruction efforts. When the war ended, Canada was among the founding members of the United Nations and played a central role in shaping its peacekeeping and diplomatic missions under the guidance of leaders like Lester B. Pearson, who would later win the Nobel Peace Prize for his role in resolving the Suez Crisis. Canada's global reputation as a fair and neutral middle power continued to grow. During the Cold War, Canada navigated a delicate path between its alliance with the United States and its desire to maintain independent policies in areas such as nuclear weapons, foreign aid, and cultural protectionism. This balance of loyalty to Western allies and commitment to independent values was made possible in part by the legal autonomy granted by the Statute of Westminster, allowing Canadian governments to make decisions based on national interest rather than imperial obligation. But even as Canada operated independently abroad, its domestic identity remained entangled with unresolved issues of national unity and constitutional authority. The statute had removed British legislative power over Canadian law, but it had not resolved the issue of amending the Constitution itself, because the British North America Act of 1867 remained a British statute. Any changes to Canada's founding law still required action by the British Parliament. This legal oddity meant that While Canada was functionally independent in most areas, it was not yet master of its own constitutional house. This limitation was increasingly seen as unacceptable, particularly during periods of political and social change, the rise of Quebec nationalism, the civil rights movements of the 1960s and 1970s, and the increasing calls for Indigenous sovereignty all underscored the need for a constitution that was both controlled by Canadians and reflective of Canadian values. Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau made this issue a central focus of his government, believing that Canada could not be truly united until it had a constitution that all Canadians could call their own. His efforts culminated in the 1980 referendum on Quebec sovereignty, which, although defeated, revealed the depth of regional discontent and the urgency of constitutional renewal. Trudeau's response was to push for patriation, the process of bringing the Constitution home from Britain and enshrining a charter of rights and freedoms that would protect individual liberties across the country. Negotiations with the provinces were long difficult and often divisive, with several provincial premiers fearing that a new constitutional framework would centralize too much power in Ottawa or diminish their ability to protect local interests. But in 1981, after a tense and dramatic conference in Ottawa, a compromise was reached between the federal government and 9 of the 10 provinces. Quebec refused to sign the agreement, citing concerns about cultural protection and representation, but the Constitution Act of 1982 went forward and was signed into law by Queen Elizabeth II and Prime Minister Trudeau in a public ceremony on Parliament Hill. It included a new amending formula, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and the symbolic act of patriation itself, ending the British Parliament's role in Canadian law. This act marked the completion of the journey that had begun with the Statute of Westminster. 50 years earlier, it was the final transfer of constitutional authority, and it ensured that any future changes to Canada's foundational laws would be made in Canada by Canadians. The Statute of Westminster had made patriation possible by granting the legal framework for Canada to act independently, but it was the Constitution Act of 1982 that completed the story. In the years since, Canadians have continued to grapple with the meaning and legacy of sovereignty, with questions about Indigenous rights, environmental jurisdiction, provincial autonomy, and national unity, all reflecting the ongoing challenge of governing a country as vast and diverse as Canada. And yet, through each of these challenges, the principles established by the Statute of Westminster continue to provide the bedrock of Canadian democracy. The idea that authority rests within Canada, that its institutions are sovereign and accountable only to its people, that its laws reflect its values, and that its future is written by its own citizens. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Statute of Westminster is not found in a single law or court case or political speech, but in the quiet confidence with which Canada conducts its affairs, in the calm strength of its institutions, in the pride of its people, and in the continued commitment to a peaceful and inclusive democracy built not through force or revolution, but through dialogue, patience, and belief in the power of law over empire. It was Canada's step toward sovereignty. But more than that, it was Canada's declaration of identity, its turning point from subject to citizen, from dominion to nation, from colony to country, and its influence will be felt for generations to come.